Sirens ripped the air before anyone could name the cause, and men with rifles ran past a low chain-link fence, while the compound's floodlights turned trailers and storage containers into interrogation rooms, every loudspeaker a blunt instrument. Hazmat suits moved in jerks and whispery arguments, boots on oil-slick concrete, while a sharp child's cry threaded through the metal and concrete like a live wire that refused to be ignored. Saitama stood just outside the fence in a yellow tracksuit, hands in his pockets, watching people move as if he dropped in by accident and found a party that had gone terribly wrong. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He only tilted his head and waited to see what the chaos would do next. A cage of chain link had been forced outward, and a pale trail led from a trailer door to a service van, and the technicians were not the worst of it. There were men in suits tallying results on tablets and a black SUV idling as if to swallow whatever the night coughed up. This is not a contained accident. This is not salvageable quietly. This is only the beginning, and worse is coming. Listen closely and subscribe if you want to know what comes after tonight, because this is not entertainment but a warning. This channel will follow the fallout, and you will see consequences unfold that cannot be unseen. Turn away now, and you will only be quieter when the damage arrives. The fence gave way without a sound because Saitama didn't push it so much as lean on it out of habit, and the metal simply decided it no longer wanted to be upright. A pair of guards saw the collapse from 20 meters away and froze in the middle of shouting orders into their radios, unsure if the failure had been structural or supernatural, and Saitama stepped through the opening as if he were entering a convenience store. Floodlights washed over his blank expression and turned his shadow into something long and distorted across the asphalt, but he didn't seem to notice the rifles lifting toward him or the urgency building in every voice around him. He looked at the trailers, the generator trucks, the medical waste bins with their lids half open, and then at the men in hazmat suits who were trying very hard not to look at him at all. A siren changed tone, and the guards finally reacted, boots slapping the pavement as they approached with weapons raised, shouting commands that Saitama listened to politely without changing his pace. One of them fired a warning shot into the air, which made several technicians flinch and drop equipment they'd been carrying, and Saitama paused long enough to glance upward at the fatting echo as if evaluating the acoustics. When the guard repeated himself louder, voice cracking with authority he didn't fully feel, Saitama nodded once and said, "Okay," then kept walking past him anyway. The guard reached for his shoulder to force compliance, and his hand met fabric that didn't move while the rest of him bounced backward onto the pavement like he'd run into a parked car. Inside the perimeter, the organization became visible in layers, with one group trying to contain something in a reinforced trailer, while another tried to erase signs that anything had gone wrong at all. Saitama drifted toward the trailer because it was where the noise was coming from, not out of concern but curiosity, and because everyone else seemed to be avoiding it with unnatural intensity. Two hazmat technicians attempted to block his path with a rolling gurney, speaking rapidly through plastic face shields, and he waited for them to finish before stepping around both the gurney and the men without touching either. Their gloved hands grabbed air where his arm had been, and they stared at each other as if the problem had briefly stopped obeying the rules of space. A side door on the trailer burst open, and a figure in a medical gown stumbled out, skin blotched and eyes unfocused, dragging an IV line behind him like a tail. He was young, maybe late teens, and his veins glowed faintly blue under the floodlights, as if something inside him had been switched on too quickly. He looked at Saitama with desperate confusion, then passed him at the guards, and raised a shaking hand that crackled with visible energy. The guards shouted, weapons coming up again, and Saitama watched the boy's hand with mild interest as the air around it began to distort. The first discharge tore a gouge out of a generator truck and sent a sheet of sparks into the night, and the guards responded with a burst of gunfire that only made the boy flinch harder and lose control. Saitama leaned slightly to one side to let a streak of energy pass by him and punch a smoking hole through a stack of crates, then looked back at the boy as if checking whether this was part of a demonstration. The boy's face twisted with panic and pain, and he screamed something no one could understand over the noise of alarms and gunshots. Saitama raised one hand and tapped the boy lightly on the forehead with 2 fingers. The glow vanished instantly, the crackling stopped, and the boy collapsed straight down like a puppet with its strings cut, breathing but unconscious. The sudden silence was so complete that the remaining alarms sounded distant and almost polite, and every person in the yard stared at Saitama with a new kind of attention that had nothing to do with trespassing. A guard lowered his rifle slowly as if worried the movement itself might be offensive, and one of the technicians whispered into his radio with a voice that had lost all professional detachment. Saitama looked down at the boy, then at the smoking truck and said, "That was loud." From the far end of the compound, headlights swept across the yard as a black SUV rolled forward with deliberate calm, ignoring the panic that had seized everyone else. The vehicle stopped at an angle that gave its occupants a clear view of Saitama, the unconscious boy, and the damaged equipment, and the rear door opened without hurry. A woman in a tailored coat stepped out first, heels clicking on the asphalt with a rhythm that suggested she was used to controlling rooms much worse than this one. She didn't raise her voice, but when she spoke into her phone, the chatter on every nearby radio abruptly cut off as if the entire facility had been muted. She watched Saitama for several long seconds before approaching, eyes scanning his outfit, his posture, the lack of visible equipment or insignia. Saitama watched her back with equal neutrality, as though she were a receptionist who had taken too long to ask how she could help. She stopped a few meters away and asked, very calmly, "Do you know where you are?" Saitama shrugged and said, "Some kind of lab," and glanced at the trailer again when another muffled sound came from inside. The woman followed his gaze and signaled subtly with 2 fingers, and a team of armed personnel began to reposition around the yard in a widening semicircle. Saitama noticed the movement only because it was in his line of sight, and he stepped aside to let one of them pass without breaking his relaxed stance. The woman introduced herself as a representative of Vought International and explained that this was a restricted research site experiencing a minor containment issue. Saitama nodded politely, then asked, "Why was that guy glowing?" Before she could answer, the trailer door rattled violently from the inside, and something heavy slammed against it with enough force to bow the reinforced metal outward. Several personnel instinctively backed away, and the woman's composure tightened by a single degree that only someone watching very closely would have noticed. Saitama turned toward the sound, interest finally sharpening just a little, not from fear, but from the novelty of something trying so hard to get out. The door tore free of its hinges and crashed onto the asphalt with a metallic scream. A larger figure stepped out into the light, muscles swollen beyond natural proportion and skin stretched tight, as if whatever was inside him had been poured in too fast. He roared without words and charged the nearest group of soldiers, swatting one aside with a casual backhand that sent him skidding across the pavement. Gunfire erupted again, louder and more desperate this time, and Saitama watched the bullets flatten uselessly against the man's chest. The woman from Vought did not flinch, but her eyes flicked once toward Saitama as if recalculating something in real time. The raging figure turned and saw Saitama standing alone in the open, unmoved by the chaos, and decided he was the next target. He sprinted forward with shocking speed for his size, asphalt cracking under his feet, and brought both fists down toward Saitama's head with the force of a demolition hammer. Saitama shifted one foot half a step to the left and let the fist smash into empty ground, creating a crater where he had been standing. He looked down at the hole, then back at the man and said, "You'll break the floor." The man roared again and swung wildly, and Saitama casually raised his hand to catch the incoming fist as if stopping a slow-moving door. The impact sent a shockwave through the yard that rattled windows and knocked several people off balance, but Saitama's arm did not bend. He squeezed slightly, not enough to injure, just enough to stop the movement, and the man's expression changed from rage to confusion to something very close to fear. Saitama released him, and the man stumbled backward, suddenly unsure of what he was supposed to do next. That was the moment everyone watching realized this was not another unstable subject, not a rival asset, and not something that fit into any of their existing categories. The Vought representative lowered her phone slowly, eyes never leaving Saitama, while the soldiers stopped firing without being told to. Saitama, meanwhile, glanced at the trailer's dark interior again, hearing a faint sound that didn't match the others, a smaller sound that didn't belong in a place like this. He took a step toward the open doorway, leaving the confused, overpowered man behind him as if he'd already lost interest. Inside the trailer, something shifted, and the air carried a different kind of tension that had nothing to do with escaped test subjects or damaged equipment. Saitama paused at the threshold, listening in a way he hadn't before, and the people outside watched him as if the entire situation now depended on what he decided to do next. No one tried to stop him this time. No one gave an order. They simply waited. Saitama stepped into the trailer with the same unhurried pace he used to enter grocery stores, and the change in lighting from floodlit asphalt to harsh fluorescent interior made him blink once in mild irritation. The air smelled sterile and metallic at the same time, like a hospital that had tried to hide something it couldn't fully clean. Rows of reinforced beds lined both sides of the narrow space, each surrounded by machines that blinked and hummed with anxious precision, and for a moment it looked less like a lab and more like a storage unit for something no one wanted to name. Saitama glanced from one bed to the next, taking in the straps, the IV bags, the injection ports taped carefully to small arms. They were children. Some were unconscious. Some were awake and staring at the ceiling with the hollow, patient stillness of people who had learned that moving only made things worse. A girl no older than 8 turned her head slightly when Saitama walked past, her eyes tracking him with the slow confusion of someone too tired to be afraid anymore. One boy's arm twitched against the restraint as faint blue veins glowed under his skin, the same color Saitama had seen outside, but dimmer, contained for now by machines that beeped in constant warning. None of them spoke, but the room had a quiet, constant sound made up of shallow breathing, nervous equipment, and the soft creak of straps shifting against metal. Saitama stopped in the center aisle and looked around without expression, as if trying to understand what kind of place this was supposed to be. He didn't react immediately, didn't tense, didn't shout, because his mind was still sorting this into categories that made sense to him. He had seen monsters, aliens, and disasters that tore cities apart, but this was different in a way that didn't fit into any of those boxes. This wasn't loud or dramatic. It was organized. Behind him, boots pounded up the metal ramp as security and medical staff rushed to the entrance, stopping short when they saw what he was looking at. No one wanted to be the first to speak, and the silence stretched long enough that the beeping machine started to feel louder than gunfire had been outside. The Vought representative stepped into the doorway with controlled composure, careful not to touch anything, careful not to look like she was intruding on a moment she suddenly didn't control. She opened her mouth to explain, to frame this as research, progress, necessity, but Saitama spoke first. "Why are they tied down?" His voice was calm, simple, and completely free of accusation, which somehow made the question worse. The woman hesitated for half a second too long and then began explaining about safety protocols, unpredictable reactions, and life-saving breakthroughs, each phrase polished from years of use in rooms where ethics had to be bent into acceptable shapes. Saitama listened without interrupting, eyes still moving from child to child, and nodded slightly as if acknowledging that he had heard her words. Then he asked, "Why are they glowing?" Before she could answer, one of the machines on the left side of the trailer began to beep faster, its warning tone rising in pitch. The boy strapped to the bed arched suddenly, back lifting off the mattress as energy crawled visibly under his skin like lightning trapped in a jar. Two technicians rushed forward with syringes, shouting instructions at each other in practiced panic, and Saitama watched them with an intensity he hadn't shown yet tonight. The boy's mouth opened in a silent scream as the glow intensified, and a hairline crack split the metal railing of the bed. Saitama moved. He didn't rush, didn't blur, didn't break anything, but he crossed the distance between himself and the bed in a single step that made no sense to the people watching. One of the technicians reached out to stop him and found himself gently turned aside, not thrown, not hurt, just relocated out of the way like furniture. Saitama placed one hand on the boy's shoulder and looked down at him with a neutral expression that slowly changed into something harder to define. The glow flickered, resisted, then went out as if someone had flipped a switch. The machines settled into a steady rhythm again. The boy went limp against the straps, breathing hard but no longer convulsing, and the entire trailer went silent except for the hum of electronics. Saitama didn't remove his hand immediately. He looked at the boy's face, at the tear tracks on his cheeks, at the tape marks on his skin where previous lines had been placed and removed. Something in his posture shifted so subtly that no one could describe it, but everyone in the doorway felt it at the same time. Outside, a new sound rolled across the compound, not sirens or shouting, but the distant thunder of something descending through the air. Several guards looked up instinctively, and the Vought representative's eyes flicked toward the exit with recognition she couldn't hide. The sound grew louder, closer, until it vibrated through the metal walls of the trailer and rattled the medical trays. Saitama glanced toward the doorway with mild curiosity, then back at the children as if whatever was arriving was secondary to what he had just seen. A gust of wind blasted through the open door as a red, white, and blue figure landed hard enough outside to crack the asphalt again. Boots hit the ground with deliberate force, and the soldiers parted automatically to make space. The figure straightened, cape settling behind him, eyes already glowing faintly as he assessed the damage, the vehicles, the scattered personnel, and finally the open trailer. His gaze hardened when he saw Saitama standing inside. Homelander stepped forward with the calm authority of someone used to being the most powerful thing in any situation, and every person in the yard unconsciously relaxed just a little at his presence. He didn't speak at first. He simply stared into the trailer at the bald man in the yellow suit standing among the restrained children as if he were trying to understand a puzzle that offended him. Saitama noticed him, gave a small nod of acknowledgement, and then looked back at the beds. Homelander walked up the ramp slowly, boots ringing against the metal, and stopped just inside the doorway. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the disrupted procedure, the technicians and Saitama's hand still resting on the boy's shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth and controlled, but edged with something sharp underneath. He asked who Saitama was and why he was interfering with a secured operation. Saitama looked at him for a moment, considering the question with genuine effort, and said, "I was outside. It was noisy." The simplicity of the answer hung in the air like an insult no one had meant to deliver. Homelander's expression didn't change, but his eyes brightened slightly as the glow intensified. He took a step closer, close enough that most people would have felt overwhelmed by his presence, and told Saitama that he needed to leave immediately. Saitama glanced at the children again, then back at Homelander and asked, "Are you in charge of this?" Homelander didn't like the tone of the question, not because it was aggressive but because it wasn't impressed. He confirmed that he was responsible for maintaining order here and repeated the demand, this time with more force behind his voice. The air itself seemed to tighten around them as if reacting to the pressure of his authority. Saitama nodded once as if acknowledging a reasonable request. Then he said they shouldn't be tied down. Homelander's eyes flared bright red. The heat vision burst forward in a controlled beam aimed directly at Saitama's chest, precise and deadly, the kind of attack that had ended conflicts instantly for years. The beam hit Saitama squarely and filled the trailer with blinding light and burning heat that made the technicians scream and stumble backward. Metal warped, plastic trays melted, and the smell of scorched air filled everyone's lungs. When the light faded, Saitama was still standing exactly where he had been. His tracksuit had a faint scorch mark on it, and he looked down at it with mild annoyance, rubbing the fabric between his fingers. "Hey," he said, "this is my only one." Homelander stopped firing. For the first time since he had entered, his expression lost its perfect control, replaced by a flicker of disbelief he couldn't mask. He stepped forward again, slower now, eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Saitama, meanwhile, gently removed his hand from the boy's shoulder and straightened up, turning fully to face him. "I think you should stop," Saitama said, voice calm but no longer bored. Outside the trailer, soldiers watched in frozen silence as the two men faced each other, and the Vought representative felt something slip out of her control in a way she had never experienced before. This was no longer a containment issue or a public relations problem. This was a variable she did not have language for. Homelander took another step forward. Saitama didn't move at all. The standoff inside the trailer held for several long seconds that felt longer than the alarms and gunfire from earlier combined, because this silence had weight to it that no one in the compound could ignore. Homelander stood with his shoulders squared and eyes still glowing faintly, recalculating a situation that had slipped outside the script he relied on to dominate every room. Saitama faced him without posture, without tension, as if he were waiting in line behind someone who was taking too long to order. The children's machines continued their steady beeping between them, a quiet reminder of what this place had been built to do. The Vought representative stepped back out of the trailer and immediately began issuing orders into her phone with a tone that returned to practiced efficiency. She requested a full data lockdown, all exterior cameras rerouted to a private server, and a communications blackout that would prevent anything leaving the site without her approval. Within minutes, vehicles were repositioned to block sightlines from the road, drones lifted into the air to monitor the perimeter, and a team from corporate security was dispatched with instructions that used the word containment far more than incident. This had already shifted from an accident to a liability, and the goal was no longer to solve it, but to control how it would be remembered. Inside, Homelander spoke again, slower now, asking Saitama to step away from the equipment and come outside so they could talk properly. Saitama looked at the nearest bed where a girl had turned her head toward them, eyes wide and unblinking, and he shook his head once. That tiny refusal carried more finality than shouting would have, and Homelander felt it in a way that made him uncomfortable without understanding why. He wasn't being challenged physically. He was being ignored in a place where his authority should have been absolute. A new voice crackled over the facility's internal speakers, calm and clinical, belonging to the head of research who had been watching through camera feeds since the moment the fence fell. He instructed all staff to vacate the immediate area and seal secondary doors, leaving only essential personnel near the trailer. The order wasn't about safety. It was about observation. They wanted to see what this unknown man would do next, how he would behave under pressure, whether he could be categorized into asset, threat, or opportunity. Saitama glanced around as people slowly backed away, noticing the retreat but not interpreting its meaning beyond simple movement. He walked past Homelander toward the rear of the trailer, where more equipment hummed behind a partition, and Homelander turned sharply to follow him, unwilling to let him wander freely through a site he considered under his protection. Saitama paused in front of a console filled with screens showing biometric readings for each child, colorful lines rising and falling in patterns he didn't understand but recognized as important. He tilted his head slightly, trying to make sense of the numbers without success. Outside the compound, a black van rolled quietly to a stop beyond the outer roadblock, its arrival unnoticed by most but immediately flagged by a drone feed sent directly to corporate headquarters. The van's doors opened, and a small group stepped out, watching the chaos from a distance through binoculars and a handheld monitor tuned to local frequencies. One of them lowered the binoculars and frowned, recognizing the red cape through the glare of floodlights and the unfamiliar yellow figure standing inside the trailer. Billy Butcher muttered something under his breath that sounded almost like disbelief. Back inside, Homelander finally lost patience with the quiet defiance and reached out to grab Saitama's shoulder, intending to physically turn him around and reassert control. His hand closed around the yellow fabric, and for a brief moment it looked like he had succeeded. Then he pulled and nothing happened. Not resistance, not force, just the absolute absence of movement, like trying to drag a building by its paint. Homelander increased his grip without thinking, and the fabric stretched slightly before snapping back into place, leaving Saitama unmoved. Saitama glanced over his shoulder, mildly puzzled. "Do you need something?" Homelander released his grip slowly, aware now that every technician, every guard, and every camera was watching this exchange with breathless focus. He stepped back, trying to recover the composure that had begun to crack, and told Saitama that this was a controlled medical environment and that interfering further would endanger the subjects. Saitama looked at the children again, at the restraints and injection lines, and said, "They don't look safe." Those words, spoken without anger or accusation, hit harder than any attack could have. The head researcher listening through the speakers realized that the narrative he had used to justify this work for years sounded hollow when reduced to that simple observation. He began quietly ordering the preparation of sedatives, not for the children, but for contingency use against Saitama if an opportunity presented itself. Vought didn't yet know what he was, but they knew they needed a plan that didn't involve asking him politely to leave. Outside the perimeter, Butcher watched through the monitor as Homelander stood inside the trailer with someone who clearly wasn't intimidated by him. He had spent years studying that posture, that body language, and he recognized immediately when Homelander was out of his element. Butcher's expression shifted from suspicion to interest to something that looked dangerously close to hope. He told his team to hold position and keep recording, because whatever this was, it might be the first unpredictable variable they had ever seen. Inside, a technician attempted to quietly remove a tray of syringes from one of the stations, hopping to clear the area without drawing attention. Saitama noticed the movement and walked over, picking up one of the syringes to examine it. The liquid inside glowed faintly blue, identical to what he had seen under the children's skin, and he turned it back and forth in the light with casual curiosity. "Is this what makes them glow?" he asked. No one answered. Homelander watched the syringe in Saitama's hand as if it were a live grenade, and the Vought representative stepped forward from the doorway with a forced calm. She explained that the compound inside was a proprietary formula designed to unlock human potential, carefully administered under expert supervision. Saitama nodded slowly, then set the syringe back down exactly where he had picked it up. He looked around the trailer one more time. Then he reached for the strap on the nearest bed. Saitama's fingers closed around the thick restraint strap with the same casual grip he might use to pick up a grocery bag, and he pulled once without effort. The reinforced material parted with a soft tearing sound that seemed impossibly quiet compared to the weight it had been designed to withstand. The girl on the bed blinked in confusion as her arm came free, not understanding that anything had changed except the sudden absence of pressure. Around the trailer, technicians shouted at once, their voices overlapping into panicked noise that had no clear instruction inside it. Homelander moved instantly, stepping forward to stop him, but Saitama had already moved to the next strap and torn it the same way. The girl sat up slowly, staring at her wrists where red marks circled the skin, and for a moment she didn't try to run because she had forgotten that running was an option. The Vought representative barked an order for sedation teams, her calm finally cracking into something urgent and sharp. Saitama didn't look at her. He was focused entirely on the beds. One by one, he pulled the restraints apart with identical, effortless motions, never rushing, never straining, just removing the straps as if he were tidying a cluttered room. The children began sitting up in confusion, some crying quietly, others too stunned to react at all. Machines beeped in protest as lines were tugged loose and sensors lost contact with skin, and the sterile order of the trailer dissolved into human noise. Homelander grabbed Saitama's arm again, this time with real force, and told him to stop. Saitama turned his head slightly. "They don't like this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the equipment. Outside the trailer, the situation spread through the compound like a shockwave. Guards who had been waiting for orders now rushed toward the entrance, unsure whether they were responding to a security breach or a medical emergency. Overhead drones repositioned to get clearer angles, feeding live footage to Vought's private servers where executives watched in horrified silence. The head researcher shouted for lockdown protocols, but no one inside the trailer could get close enough to Saitama to enforce them. A boy stumbled off his bed and fell to his knees, pulling an IV line with him that snapped and sprayed fluid across the floor. Another child began crying loudly, the sound echoing down the metal walls and out into the night air beyond. Saitama gently lifted the boy back onto his feet and guided him toward the door with a light push between the shoulders. He wasn't thinking about consequences. He was simply removing what he saw as the problem in front of him. When the first child stepped out of the trailer and into the open yard, the soldiers outside froze, unsure whether to treat this as a rescue or a containment failure. The Vought representative shouted for them to hold position, but the moment had already slipped past her ability to define it. More children followed, some walking, some being helped by others, all blinking against the floodlights as if emerging from underground. The compound, built to hide this operation, suddenly had its purpose exposed in the most visible way possible. High above, a news helicopter that had been circling miles away for unrelated coverage drifted closer after picking up unusual radio chatter. Its camera zoomed in on the brightly lit yard, catching the unmistakable image of children in hospital gowns wandering across an industrial site surrounded by armed men. The footage streamed live before anyone at Vought realized it had been seen, and within minutes producers were shouting into headsets, demanding context no one could provide. Inside the trailer, Homelander's patience snapped. He stepped in front of Saitama and physically blocked his path to the remaining beds, eyes glowing bright again as his voice rose with real anger for the first time. He accused Saitama of endangering lives, of causing chaos he didn't understand, of interfering in things far beyond him. Saitama listened quietly, then glanced past him at a small boy still strapped down, struggling weakly against the restraints. He stepped around Homelander without touching him. That small act of disregard hit harder than any attack could have. Homelander turned sharply, grabbing for him again, but Saitama had already torn the last straps and helped the boy sit up. The boy looked at him with wide, terrified eyes and asked in a shaking voice if he was in trouble. Saitama shook his head once. "No," he said, "you can go outside." Outside the perimeter, Butcher lowered his binoculars slowly as he watched children spill out of a place that was clearly never meant to be seen. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He just stared with a focused intensity that meant his mind was racing ahead of what his eyes were seeing. He told his team to start recording everything and to get ready, because this was about to become bigger than any of them had planned for. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to expose Vought. He was thinking about the man in the yellow suit who had just done it by accident. Back in the yard, sirens began wailing again as local police, alerted by the helicopter footage and frantic calls from nearby roads, approached the facility from multiple directions. Vought security tried to wave them off at the gate, but cameras were already pointed, reporters already speaking into microphones with the compound in the background. The narrative Vought had built for years began to collapse in real time under live broadcast. Homelander stepped out of the trailer into this chaos and looked around at the children, the cameras in the sky, the soldiers who no longer knew what they were guarding. He felt something unfamiliar creeping into his thoughts, loss of control not through force, but through exposure. He turned back toward Saitama with a look that was no longer just anger but something closer to desperation. Saitama walked out of the trailer last, looking around at the noise and lights with mild confusion, as if he had stepped into a situation that had grown far bigger than he expected. Children clung to each other nearby, technicians argued with soldiers, and reporters shouted questions no one could answer. Saitama scratched the back of his head and looked at Homelander. "Is this part of the lab?" he asked. The first military helicopters arrived before the police had even decided where to park, their rotor wash flattening grass and sending loose papers skidding across the asphalt like fleeing insects. Spotlights cut through the floodlights from above, crisscrossing the compound with harsh white beams that made everything look staged and unreal. Soldiers in dark uniforms poured out beyond the outer gate with practiced speed, forming a perimeter that overlapped awkwardly with Vought's private security, neither side fully trusting the other, but both aware that the situation had grown beyond corporate discretion. Saitama stood near the trailer with a small group of children clustered behind him, watching the helicopters with mild interest as if they were an unexpected parade. Loudspeakers barked overlapping commands that contradicted each other, one voice demanding everyone drop to the ground, while another insisted the area was under federal control and not to interfere. The confusion spread quickly because no one had a protocol for a secret corporate test site being exposed on live television, while a superhuman standoff unfolded in the center of it. Reporters shouted over the noise from behind police tape that had gone up too late to matter, and camera lenses zoomed in on Saitama's expressionless face, as if trying to read meaning where there was none. He glanced at the children behind him, and then back at the helicopters, clearly unsure why everyone was making such a fuss. Homelander rose into the air with deliberate slowness, hovering high enough that everyone could see him, but low enough to remain part of the scene. He spoke to the arriving military commander midair with a calm voice that carried easily over the chaos, explaining that the situation was under control and that Vought would handle internal matters. The commander, sweating under the lights and pressure, looked from Homelander to the children in hospital gowns to the man in the yellow suit, and realized nothing about this felt controlled. Orders came through his earpiece from higher up the chain of command, telling him to secure the area, detain all unauthorized individuals, and prevent any further media exposure. Saitama watched a line of soldiers approach cautiously, rifles pointed in his direction with the careful posture of men who had been told they were facing something unpredictable. He didn't react beyond shifting slightly so he wasn't blocking the children from view, as if assuming the soldiers were there to help. One of the children tugged lightly on the back of his tracksuit, and he looked down as the boy asked if they were going back inside. Saitama shook his head. "You're fine," he said, simple and certain. A sharp order was shouted, and several soldiers fired non-lethal rounds designed to incapacitate without killing. The round struck Saitama's chest and legs with dull thuds and fell harmlessly to the ground, bouncing off as if they had hit a padded wall. The soldiers froze in confusion, and one of them instinctively checked his weapon as if it had malfunctioned. Saitama looked down at the pellets around his feet and then back at the soldiers. "Please don't," he said, not annoyed, just tired. High above, more helicopters circled, their cameras feeding images to news networks that had abandoned all scheduled programming. Analysts speculated wildly, while the footage showed children, soldiers, Homelander in the air, and the unidentified man at the center of it all. Social media erupted with clips and theories, and within minutes the entire world was watching an event no one fully understood. Vought's crisis teams were already working phones furiously, trying to shape a narrative that was dissolving faster than they could construct it. From the roadside van, Butcher watched the military join the chaos and let out a low whistle. He had spent years trying to force this kind of exposure with careful planning and dirty work, and here it was happening because one bored man had wandered into the wrong place. He told his team to stay put and keep recording, because stepping in now would only ruin whatever was unfolding naturally. For once, he didn't want to interfere. He wanted to see how far this would go on its own. Back in the compound, a commanding officer finally ordered a tactical advance toward Saitama and the children, hoping that numbers and discipline would accomplish what weapons had not. Dozens of soldiers moved in formation, boots pounding in unison, creating a wall of dark uniforms that closed in from multiple directions. The children instinctively huddled closer behind Saitama, and he glanced back at them with a puzzled expression, clearly trying to understand why they were being approached like criminals. When the first soldier reached out to grab one of the kids, Saitama moved his arm slightly outward without thinking. The motion was small, casual, and completely unremarkable from his perspective, but the air displaced by that gesture hit the advancing line of soldiers like an invisible wave. Men were lifted off their feet and thrown backward in a wide arc, tumbling across the pavement and colliding with vehicles in a tangle of limbs and equipment. No one was crushed, no one was broken, but the entire formation was instantly erased as if it had never existed. The helicopters above wobbled in the turbulence from the shockwave, and camera feeds shook wildly as operators struggled to keep focus. Homelander dropped a few feet in the air, startled despite himself, and stared at Saitama with open disbelief. The military commander shouted for everyone to hold position, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and awe he couldn't hide. The world watching from screens saw dozens of trained soldiers scattered like toys by a movement that looked like nothing at all. Saitama blinked at the empty space in front of him, and then at the soldiers groaning on the ground. "Sorry," he said quietly, as if he had bumped into someone in a crowded store. That was the moment the situation crossed an invisible line. This was no longer a corporate scandal, no longer a contained security failure, no longer a misunderstanding between authorities. This was now a global incident involving a man who could casually invalidate military force without appearing to try. Phones rang in government buildings across multiple countries as officials demanded updates, explanations, and contingency plans that didn't exist. Homelander slowly descended back to the ground, cape settling behind him as he kept his eyes locked on Saitama. For the first time in his life, he was standing next to someone whose presence made his own power feel small. Not threatened, not challenged, just irrelevant. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out because nothing he could say would restore the sense of control he had lost tonight. Saitama, meanwhile, looked around at the helicopters, the cameras, the scattered soldiers, and the frightened children behind him. He scratched his head again, genuinely confused. "Why is everyone outside?" he asked. The noise in the compound never really settled after the soldiers were thrown back. It simply changed shape into something tighter and more controlled as higher authorities began speaking through earpieces instead of loudspeakers. Command vehicles arrived and parked in sharp lines beyond the gate, antennas lifting into the air like metallic periscopes, while officers inside tried to assemble a plan that accounted for a man no one could classify. The children were hurried behind armored trucks by medics who moved carefully around Saitama, treating him less like a suspect and more like a weather pattern they didn't want to disturb. He watched them work with a neutral expression, relieved that someone else had taken over the task of looking after the kids. In the sky, the helicopters repositioned into a wider circle, creating a visible boundary around the site that the world could see from every broadcast angle. News anchors spoke in urgent tones about an unidentified superhuman, about leaked footage from a covert facility, about the presence of Homelander and federal troops in the same frame. Governments across the world began demanding explanations from Vought, and Vought responded with statements that grew more careful with each passing minute. What had started as a quiet disaster inside a fenced perimeter was now a geopolitical problem unfolding in real time. Homelander stood a short distance from Saitama, watching him without speaking, trying to decide whether approaching again would make him look authoritative or foolish. He wasn't used to this calculation because no one had ever forced him to make it before. Saitama noticed him staring and gave a small, polite nod, the kind you give a stranger you've already spoken to once. That simple gesture made Homelander feel strangely dismissed, as if he had already been categorized and filed away. At the edge of the roadblock, the black van door slid open and Butcher stepped out, keeping his distance but moving closer than before. He wasn't trying to hide now because there was nothing left to hide. The entire scene was already exposed to the world. Through binoculars, he watched Saitama standing among military vehicles and children as if he were waiting for a bus that was running late. Butcher had seen men terrified of Homelander, furious at Homelander, obsessed with Homelander, but he had never seen someone treat him like background noise. Back in the compound, a decision was made inside one of the command vehicles that shifted the tone yet again. If Saitama could not be detained, then he needed to be tested, evaluated, measured in some way that gave the situation structure. A specialized unit moved forward carrying equipment designed to scan for radiation, energy signatures, anything that might explain what he was. They approached slowly, announcing their intentions as if speaking to a wild animal, and Saitama watched them with mild curiosity. They passed handheld devices over him, screens flickering with readings that made no sense to the operators. One device overloaded and went dark, another returned a flat line as if scanning empty air, and a third began emitting a warning tone that no one had heard before. The technicians stepped back, whispering into their radios, and Saitama looked down at the silent devices in their hands. "Is it broken?" he asked, genuinely concerned he might have caused a problem. Homelander finally walked over again, careful now, speaking in a tone that was more measured than before. He told Saitama that things had gotten complicated and suggested they move somewhere quieter to talk. Saitama looked around at the flashing lights, the helicopters, the people running in every direction, and nodded. "Yeah, it's kind of loud," he agreed. Before either of them could move, a distant rumble rolled across the night sky, deeper and heavier than the helicopters. Several people looked up instinctively as a military jet screamed overhead at low altitude, circling back for another pass. The presence of Air Force assets changed the emotional temperature instantly, because jets were not brought in for observation. They were brought in for last resort options. Orders crackled through headsets to maintain distance and wait for authorization, but the message had already been sent simply by the jet's arrival. Cameras caught the silhouette of the aircraft against the floodlights, and commentators on live broadcasts began speculating about whether the government was preparing to use force. The children behind the truck started crying again at the sound, and Saitama glanced back at them with a small frown. When the jet made its second pass, something dropped from its underside, small and fast, trailing a thin line of smoke. People on the ground shouted warnings that overlapped into noise, and Homelander's eyes snapped upward as he realized what was happening. He launched into the air instantly, streaking toward the falling object to intercept it before it reached the compound. Saitama watched the arc of the object with mild interest, then looked at the children again. He raised one hand casually and flicked his fingers upward. The air above the compound rippled like disturbed water, and the falling projectile vanished in a silent flash so small that many people thought their eyes had tricked them. Homelander stopped midair, hovering where the object should have been, staring at empty space. No explosion followed. No impact came. The sky simply returned to normal as if nothing had happened. On the ground, every radio went silent at once. Inside command vehicles, officers stared at their screens in disbelief as telemetry from the projectile cut off without detonation or debris. The jet banked hard and pulled away, its pilot shouting confused questions into a channel that no one answered. Across the world, viewers watched the replay of the moment in stunned silence, trying to understand how a weapon had been erased without a trace. Saitama lowered his hand and looked around. "That was close," he said mildly. That was when the situation crossed from dangerous to incomprehensible. Military force had been attempted, not aggressively but cautiously, and it had been nullified in a way that didn't follow any known rules. Governments stopped talking about containment and started talking about contingency plans for something far beyond Vought, beyond Homelander, beyond anything they had prepared for. Homelander descended slowly back to the ground, landing a short distance from Saitama with an expression he could no longer control. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was standing next to something that operated on a scale he couldn't even measure. He didn't feel threatened. He felt small. Saitama looked at him and asked, "Did I do something wrong?" The compound no longer sounded like an emergency site. It sounded like a command center at the edge of a war no one understood. Radios carried quieter voices now, clipped and deliberate, as if speaking too loudly might provoke something watching them. Floodlights remained fixed on Saitama's position without anyone consciously deciding to keep them there, and the children had been moved farther back behind layers of vehicles and personnel who didn't know whether they were guarding them or shielding them. Saitama stood where he had been, hands resting at his sides, looking like someone waiting for instructions that never came. Homelander paced in a slow semicircle a short distance away, trying to recover the posture that had always worked for him in the past. He told himself this was still manageable, still within the realm of influence if he chose the right tone, the right show of strength. He approached Saitama again, this time without anger, and suggested they move away from the cameras to prevent further panic. Saitama nodded politely and took a few steps with him, not because he felt compelled, but because it seemed like a reasonable idea. They stopped near a stack of supply crates where the lights didn't hit as directly, and Homelander lowered his voice as if sharing something confidential. He explained that the children were part of a program designed to create heroes who would save lives, that the process looked harsh but served a greater good. Saitama listened carefully, eyes calm, then glanced past Homelander toward the trucks where the kids were huddled. "They didn't look like they were being saved," he said simply. Those words landed heavier than any accusation. Homelander felt the ground of the conversation slipping away from him because Saitama wasn't arguing. He was observing. There was no ideology to push against, no moral stance to debate, just a plain statement that was hard to refute without sounding ridiculous. Homelander tried again, this time with a firmer edge, telling Saitama that he didn't understand how the world worked and that interfering further would only make things worse. Saitama tilted his head slightly. Worse for who? Behind them, a new group of figures entered the compound under military escort, moving with the confidence of people used to being called when situations defied normal authority. They were subs from Vought's roster, each one chosen for power, durability, and public image, now brought in as a last attempt to reassert dominance through familiarity. Cameras immediately turned toward them, eager to capture heroes arriving to fix the scene. The crowd beyond the perimeter cheered nervously, hoping this would return things to something recognizable. The subs approached in formation, spreading out to create a visible wall between Saitama and the rest of the compound. One of them raised a hand that began to glow with kinetic energy, another flexed metal gauntlets that hummed with stored force, and a third took to the air with a low, steady hover. They didn't attack immediately. They posed, waiting for Saitama to react to the display. Saitama watched them with mild interest, like someone observing a street performance he hadn't asked to see. Homelander stepped back to give them space, confident that this show of coordinated power would shift the emotional balance. He expected Saitama to at least show curiosity or caution, something that acknowledged the threat. Instead, Saitama looked at the glowing hands, the humming gauntlets, the hovering figure, and said, "Are you guys with the lab too?" The question broke the rhythm of the moment so completely that no one knew how to respond. One of the subs shouted a warning and launched forward, slamming a charged fist into Saitama's shoulder with enough force to crumple a car. The impact thundered across the compound, sending dust and debris into the air and making nearby vehicles rock on their suspensions. When the dust settled, Saitama was still standing exactly where he had been, looking at his shoulder with mild curiosity. He brushed at the fabric as if removing lint. "You'll tear it," he said. The second supe rushed in from the side, gauntlets swinging with mechanical precision, and Saitama casually stepped aside without looking, letting the blows pass through empty air. The third dove from above, tackling him from behind in a desperate attempt to force him to the ground. Saitama stumbled forward half a step from the surprise, then straightened up, the airborne supe sliding off his back and landing awkwardly on the pavement. No one watching could understand what they were seeing because there was no effort, no visible defense, no escalation from Saitama at all. The sups weren't being overpowered, they were being invalidated. Their attacks didn't fail because he resisted them. They failed because he barely acknowledged them as meaningful. Frustration turned into panic, and all three attacked at once with everything they had, energy flaring, metal slamming, air pressure cracking like thunder. Saitama raised one hand absent-mindedly and swatted outward, not striking anyone directly but pushing the space in front of him away. The resulting shockwave lifted the three sups off their feet and sent them tumbling across the compound, crashing into equipment and skidding to a stop in a heap of groaning limbs. The crowd beyond the perimeter fell silent. Homelander stared at the fallen sups and then at Saitama, realizing that this had not re-established control. It had done the opposite. Every demonstration of power only made Saitama look more detached, more untouchable, more like the only stable point in a situation that was unraveling. Dominance was no longer about strength. It was about whose presence made everything else look meaningless. Saitama looked around at the damage, then at the sups trying to sit up and sighed quietly. "Can we stop?" he asked. From the roadside, Butcher lowered his binoculars again, a slow grin spreading across his face despite himself. He wasn't seeing a fight. He was seeing the first thing in years that made Vought's entire structure look fragile. He muttered to himself that this bald bloke might be the most dangerous thing Homelander had ever met, not because he wanted to win, but because he didn't care about winning at all. Back in the compound, sirens began again as more emergency vehicles arrived, drawn by the escalating reports. The night air felt charged, heavy with the sense that this was no longer an incident to be resolved, but a turning point that couldn't be undone. Saitama glanced toward the children once more, checking that they were still safe behind the trucks. He didn't notice that every camera in the world was still pointed at him. The compound had stopped trying to look organized and had started to look overwhelmed, as if the place itself understood it was no longer the center of control, but the center of exposure. Floodlights still burned overhead, but now they illuminated wrecked equipment, overturned vehicles, and sups being helped to their feet by medics who didn't know where to look while they worked. The children were being wrapped in thermal blankets and guided toward ambulances, their small faces pale under the lights as cameras zoomed in from beyond the perimeter. Saitama watched the process with quiet approval, satisfied that someone else had taken responsibility for something he no longer needed to manage. Inside the command vehicles, conversations turned from strategy to damage control, and then from damage control to survival. Executives from Vought International were patched into secure lines with government officials who no longer sounded cooperative but accusatory. Words like illegal experimentation, human rights, and criminal liability were being used openly now, without the careful phrasing that had protected Vought for decades. The company's carefully constructed image, as the supplier of heroes, was dissolving under live broadcast into something much darker. Saitama stood near a stack of crates again, arms hanging loosely at his sides, looking like a man who had wandered too far into someone else's problem. He watched medics load the last of the children into ambulances and then looked back toward the trailer, now empty and silent. The place that had drawn him in with noise and confusion had gone eerily still, as if waiting for him to decide whether it still mattered. He didn't feel urgency. He felt something closer to mild discomfort that hadn't found words yet. A sudden burst of shouting pulled his attention back to the center of the yard, where a new group of armored personnel was rushing forward, Not military, not Vought security, but a specialized tactical unit wearing insignia that marked them as Federal Response. They carried heavy equipment between them, something cylindrical and reinforced, cables trailing behind it like veins. The object was set down on the pavement with deliberate care, and technicians began attaching control devices to it with nervous hands. This wasn't meant to knock him down. This was meant to contain him. Homelander watched from a short distance, recognizing the equipment even before the technicians finished assembling it. It was a prototype restraint system designed for worst-case scenarios involving sups who could not be reasoned with or defeated conventionally. He hadn't believed they would ever actually use it. Not on him. Not on anyone. Seeing it deployed now felt like watching a last page of a manual no one had expected to read. Saitama looked at the device with mild curiosity. "Is that for me?" he asked, genuinely unsure. No one answered. The unit activated the device, and a low hum spread through the air, rising in pitch as a shimmering field expanded outward in a wide dome centered on the cylinder. The surface of the field distorted the light around it, bending the floodlights into warped streaks as it reached Saitama's position and passed through him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hum grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the pavement and into everyone's bones. Inside the command vehicle, readings spiked wildly as the device tried to measure what it was interacting with. Numbers flashed red, alarms chirped, and a technician shouted that the system was overloading. The field began to flicker like a failing bulb, pulsing in uneven waves that made the air shimmer violently. Saitama looked down at his arms as the distortion rippled across his suit, mildly impressed by the visual effect. "It tickles," he said. The cylinder cracked down the middle with a sharp metallic snap, and the hum cut off instantly as the device tore itself apart from internal strain. Pieces fell to the ground smoking, cables whipping uselessly in the air before going limp. The tactical unit backed away quickly, eyes wide behind their visors, realizing they had just exhausted one of the most advanced containment tools available without slowing him for even a second. The failure didn't just discourage them, it scared them. Because it meant there was nothing left to escalate to that didn't involve outright destruction. At the roadside, Butcher watched through the monitor as the device failed and muttered a low curse. He had heard rumors of that tech, stories about how it could hold even the most violent sups in place long enough to transport them. Seeing it break like a toy confirmed something he had started to suspect hours ago. This wasn't a matter of strength anymore. This was a matter of scale. Back in the compound, a new order moved quietly through the ranks of officers and officials, spoken in low voices that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Evacuate non-essential personnel. Clear the airspace. Prepare for a worst-case scenario response if authorization came through. No one said the word, but everyone knew what it implied. Saitama noticed the sudden movement as people began pulling back farther from him, widening the empty space around where he stood. He looked around at the retreating lines of vehicles and personnel with mild confusion, trying to understand why everyone was leaving now that things had calmed down. He glanced toward Homelander, hopping for some explanation. "Are they going home?" he asked. Homelander didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the officers receiving orders through their headsets, at the helicopters pulling farther back into the night sky, at the slow, deliberate clearing of space that felt less like caution and more like preparation. For the first time, he understood that this had moved beyond him entirely. Whatever decision was coming next wasn't his to make. The night grew quieter in a strange, unnatural way as engines shut off and vehicles rolled backward. Even the reporters beyond the perimeter sensed the shift and lowered their voices, unsure why the energy had changed so suddenly. Cameras remained fixed on Saitama, now standing almost alone in the center of a wide, empty circle of asphalt. He scratched his head again, looking genuinely puzzled. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, mostly to himself. Far above, beyond what any camera could see, something began moving into position. The quiet that settled over the compound wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that forms when too many people are waiting for the same terrible decision to be confirmed. Vehicles had pulled back to the edges of the property, leaving a wide, empty expanse of asphalt around Saitama that felt deliberate, measured, and deeply unnatural. The floodlights still burned, but now they illuminated nothing except a single man in a yellow tracksuit standing at the center of a clearing no one wanted to enter. He looked around at the space with mild confusion, as if someone had rearranged the room while he wasn't paying attention. Homelander stood off to the side, cape barely moving in the night air, listening to voices through his earpiece that he didn't like. They weren't asking him to handle this anymore. They were asking him to step back. That request alone told him how far the situation had escalated beyond his place in it. For the first time, he wasn't the solution being discussed. He was being treated like part of the risk. Saitama glanced toward the ambulances in the distance where the children were being loaded and nodded slightly, satisfied that they were safe and no longer the focus of attention. His interest in the scene began to fade, and he took a small step, as if considering whether it was time to leave. That single motion caused a wave of tension to ripple through the officers watching from behind vehicles, because they had been told to report the moment he moved. High above the cloud cover, beyond sight and sound, a satellite adjusted its position with mechanical precision. Data streamed into command centers across continents where analysts watched live feeds with hands hovering over confirmation keys they hoped they wouldn't have to press. The decision had been made minutes ago in rooms far from this place, justified with words like precaution, necessity, and last resort. None of those words changed the fact that they were about to test something on Saitama that had only ever existed as theory. On the ground, Saitama paused mid-step and looked up slightly, not because he sensed danger but because he felt something odd in the air, like a pressure change before a storm. He squinted at the sky for a moment, then shrugged when he didn't see anything. Homelander watched him carefully, realizing that Saitama had no idea what was about to happen, and for reasons he couldn't explain, that bothered him. Then the night turned white. A column of light descended from the sky with impossible speed, striking the exact center of the compound with a force that erased sound before it arrived. The impact flattened vehicles, shattered windows for miles, and turned asphalt into a rolling wave that rippled outward like water. Cameras cut to static instantly as the electromagnetic pulse fried equipment, and every person watching live coverage around the world lost the feed at the same time. From a distance, it looked like a small sun had touched the ground. The shockwave tore across the landscape, flipping armored trucks and sending debris spiraling into the air. Officers and soldiers who had taken cover behind vehicles were thrown hard against metal, ears ringing, vision blurred. Homelander was hurled backward through the air despite trying to brace himself, slamming into a concrete barrier hundreds of meters away. The command vehicles beyond the gate went dark as power systems failed under the surge. When the light finally faded, a massive crater filled the center of the compound where Saitama had been standing. Smoke rose in thick columns, carrying the smell of burned metal and scorched earth into the sky. Fires crackled across the wreckage, and distant alarms wailed from vehicles that still had working batteries. For several long seconds, no one moved because no one could process what they were seeing. This was not an escalation they had believed they would actually witness. Then from the center of the crater, Saitama climbed out. He brushed dust off his shoulders and looked around at the destruction with genuine surprise, as if someone had redecorated the area while he was distracted. His suit was dirty now, torn slightly at the sleeve, and he frowned at it with mild irritation. "That was loud," he said to no one in particular. The officers watching from a distance felt something cold settle into their stomachs. The worst thing they could have imagined had been used, and it had accomplished nothing except making him dirty. Radios crackled back to life slowly as systems rebooted, and the first broken reports began to filter through, voices trembling as they described what they were seeing. Homelander pushed himself out of the rubble he had been thrown into and stared across the ruined compound at Saitama standing unharmed in the crater. For the first time, there was no anger in his expression, no pride, no need to posture. There was only quiet realization. He wasn't looking at a rival. He was looking at something that existed on a completely different level of reality. Saitama stepped out of the crater and looked around at the fires, the broken vehicles, and the scattered personnel struggling to stand. His expression changed slightly, not to anger but to confusion tinged with discomfort. This damage hadn't been here before. This wasn't part of the lab, wasn't part of the strange argument everyone had been having. This was new, and it didn't make sense to him. He looked toward Homelander, who was limping slightly as he approached, and asked, "Did something explode?" No one answered immediately, because no one knew how to explain what had just happened in a way that fit into Saitama's simple understanding of cause and effect. Around them, the world was reconnecting to shattered feeds, satellites realigning, governments demanding updates that no one could give without sounding insane. The word weapon was being whispered in rooms that suddenly felt much smaller than they had before. Saitama looked down at the cracked asphalt, then at the burning wreckage, and finally at the distant ambulances where the children had been taken. A small crease formed between his eyebrows, not from fear but from something else beginning to settle into place. He realized this damage had been done because of him. Smoke drifted low across the ruined compound, turning the floodlights into hazy halos that made everything look distant and unreal. Small fires burned in pockets where vehicles had been crushed, and the sound of crackling metal mixed with the groans of people trying to stand after being thrown across pavement. Saitama walked slowly out of the crater, stepping over twisted debris with careful, absent-minded movements, as if he were navigating clutter in a messy apartment. His eyes moved across the destruction with growing unease, not because he felt threatened, but because this damage had not been here before he arrived. Homelander approached from the side, brushing dust and concrete from his suit, his usual composure replaced by something quieter and more uncertain. He didn't speak right away, because there was nothing he could say that would make this look like control. Saitama glanced at him, and then passed him toward the distant road where the ambulances had been staged earlier. The vehicles were gone now, replaced by flashing lights and scattered personnel trying to regroup in the aftermath. A medic stumbled toward them, helmet cracked, face streaked with ash, shouting something over and over that didn't register at first. It took a moment before the words separated into meaning. One of the ambulances had been caught in the shockwave when the blast hit. It had flipped twice before skidding off the road into a drainage ditch. The crew had been thrown clear. The children inside had not. Saitama stopped walking. The world around him seemed to quiet again, not because the noise had faded, but because his attention narrowed so completely that everything else lost importance. He looked in the direction the medic was pointing, eyes steady, expression blank in a way that felt different from before. Homelander followed his gaze and understood instantly what that silence meant. They moved at the same time, but Saitama was already gone. He crossed the distance between the compound and the road in a single step that left the air behind him snapping like a whip. Homelander launched into the air after him, arriving seconds later at the wreckage of the ambulance half submerged in muddy water. The vehicle had been torn open by the impact, its rear doors twisted into shapes they were never meant to hold. Emergency lights still blinked weakly, reflecting off the water in slow, useless pulses. Saitama stood beside the wreck, staring down into it. Two children lay motionless inside, still wrapped in thermal blankets, their small forms unnaturally still against the wrecked interior. A medic knelt nearby, hands shaking as he tried to check for signs of life he already knew weren't there. The night air felt heavy and close, filled with the smell of mud, smoke, and something else that made Saitama's chest tighten in a way he had never experienced before. He climbed into the ruined ambulance carefully, as if afraid to disturb something fragile, and knelt beside the nearest child. He placed 2 fingers gently against the boy's neck, the same casual gesture he had used earlier to stop the glowing energy in the trailer. Nothing changed. No flicker of life returned. No miracle happened. For the first time since arriving at the compound, Saitama's face showed something unmistakable. Not anger. Not confusion. Guilt. He sat back slowly in the wreckage, staring at his hand as if trying to understand why it had worked before and not now. In his mind, the cause and effect lined up in a simple, painful way. He had come here. The world had reacted. This had happened. Homelander landed a few feet away and didn't approach. He had never seen this expression on anyone with power before, because most people with power never allowed themselves to feel responsible for consequences. Watching Saitama sit there in silence, shoulders slightly slumped, felt more unsettling than any show of strength had been. Behind them, more personnel arrived cautiously, but no one spoke. They stood at a distance, understanding instinctively that this was not a moment to interrupt. Cameras that had begun reconnecting to live feeds caught the image of the bald man in a yellow suit kneeling inside a wrecked ambulance, and millions of people around the world watched in confused silence without knowing the full story. Saitama gently pulled the blanket up over the child's chest, an awkward, careful gesture that didn't quite look like anything he had done before. He climbed back out of the ambulance and stood in the mud, staring down at the water collecting around his boots. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that made everyone nearby strain to hear it. They were fine, he said. No one corrected him, because they understood what he meant. They had been fine until the world decided he was a problem that needed to be solved. Saitama turned slowly to look back toward the smoking remains of the compound in the distance. His eyes weren't angry, but they were no longer bored, no longer curious, no longer detached. Something inside him had shifted into place with terrible clarity. The simple line of logic that guided his actions had found a new direction. Homelander watched that change happen in real time and felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with fear for himself. He realized that whatever came next would not be casual, not accidental, not indifferent. For the first time tonight, Saitama cared. And that made him infinitely more dangerous than he had been before. Saitama took one slow breath, then another, and looked back toward the facility where people were still scrambling through smoke and debris. The floodlights made the ruin look small from this distance, like a toy set that had been knocked over. He started walking back toward it, each step measured and deliberate, mud dripping from his boots. He didn't hurry. He didn't run. He simply walked with a purpose no one there had seen from him yet. Saitama walked back toward the compound through drifting smoke and scattered debris, his pace steady and unhurried in a way that felt far more ominous than a sprint would have. The fires were beginning to die down, leaving behind twisted metal and cracked asphalt that still radiated heat into the night air. Personnel who had been rushing moments ago slowed when they saw him returning, stepping aside instinctively without being told. No one tried to stop him now, not out of strategy, but out of a quiet understanding that intervention had become meaningless. Homelander followed at a distance, no longer trying to lead or confront, simply watching. He had seen rage before, explosive and loud, but this was something else entirely. Saitama wasn't angry in a way that burned outward. He was focused in a way that pulled everything inward, narrowing the world down to a single line of cause, an effect that no one else could interrupt. The compound ahead, once the center of control, now looked fragile and exposed under the harsh lights. Inside the command vehicles, voices had returned to shouting as feeds came back online, and decision-makers demanded updates. They were asking for status reports, casualty numbers, and most of all, options. There were none left that didn't involve consequences no one was willing to say out loud. The realization spread slowly through the ranks that the worst thing they had done tonight wasn't failing to stop Saitama. It was trying. Saitama reached the edge of the crater where he had first been struck by the weapon from above and paused, looking down into it with quiet thoughtfulness. The cracked earth, the shattered vehicles, the smoking wreckage all told a story he didn't need explained. He turned his head slightly toward the largest intact structure remaining on the property, a reinforced building that housed the core of the research operation. Lights still flickered inside as technicians tried to salvage data and protect servers that suddenly mattered more than anything else. He changed direction and began walking toward that building. Security teams stationed near the entrance saw him coming and immediately stepped aside, radios buzzing with panicked questions they didn't bother answering. The heavy steel doors at the entrance were still sealed from earlier lockdown protocols, and Saitama stopped in front of them, staring at the keypad mounted beside the frame. He looked at it for a moment, then knocked lightly on the door with his knuckles. The entire reinforced entrance folded inward with a deep metallic groan, hinges snapping like brittle twigs as the doors collapsed into the hallway beyond. Dust rolled outward across the ground, and Saitama stepped through the opening as if entering a quiet office building after hours. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered over long corridors lined with glass rooms full of equipment and observation stations. Technicians scattered at the sight of him, abandoning terminals and backing into corners with hands raised as if that gesture still meant something. Saitama walked past them without looking, eyes scanning the space with calm intensity. He wasn't searching randomly. He was looking for the place where decisions had been made, the place where the process had started. He found it in a central lab filled with screens displaying data streams from the night's events, paused mid-update when power had flickered. Racks of servers hummed loudly in the background, their indicator lights blinking in steady rhythm. A group of senior researchers stood frozen near a console, staring at Saitama as if they were witnessing the physical form of a consequence they had never believed would arrive. Saitama looked at the screens, then at the syringes laid out neatly on a tray, then at the restraints hanging from the sides of empty beds. His gaze lingered there for a long moment before he turned back to the people in the room. "You did this?" he asked, not accusing, just confirming. No one answered. "They didn't need to." Saitama nodded once, as if that was all the information he required. He reached out and placed his hand gently on the nearest server rack, feeling the vibration of the machines through his palm. Then he pushed forward slightly, not with force, just with intent. The entire row of servers slid backward through the wall behind them, as if the concrete had briefly forgotten how to be solid. Alarms erupted instantly throughout the building as systems failed in cascading sequence. Screens went dark, lights flickered and died, and the hum of electronics fell into abrupt silence. Technicians stumbled backward, staring at the gaping hole where years of data storage had been moments before. Saitama moved to the next rack and did the same thing, erasing the heart of the operation with quiet, methodical motions that looked almost gentle. Outside, Homelander watched through the shattered entrance as the lights inside the building went out one by one. He understood what Saitama was doing, and the simplicity of it unsettled him deeply. This wasn't destruction for revenge. This was removal. Saitama wasn't attacking people. He was removing the system that had caused the problem in the first place. Inside the lab, the last of the servers disappeared through the walls, leaving behind only empty racks and drifting dust. Saitama looked around once more, confirming that nothing remained that could be used to repeat what he had seen in the trailer. He turned and walked back toward the entrance without another word. Behind him, the researchers sank into chairs or onto the floor, staring at the dead screens in disbelief. Decades of work, billions of dollars, and the core of Vought's most guarded program had vanished in less than a minute without violence, without chaos, without drama. It had simply been erased. Saitama stepped back out into the night air, the compound now dim and quiet behind him. Smoke still drifted across the floodlights, and personnel watched him from a distance with a mix of awe and fear they couldn't hide. He looked around at the damage one more time, then up at the sky where the weapon had come from. He didn't say anything. He just stared. The compound had gone quiet in a way that no emergency site ever should, with smoke drifting through broken lights and personnel standing in small, uncertain groups that no longer had orders to follow. The main lab behind Saitama was dark now, its purpose erased so completely that it looked like an abandoned shell rather than the center of a secret operation. Vehicles remained where they had been thrown, and the night air felt heavy with the kind of stillness that comes after something irreversible has already happened. Saitama stood in the middle of it all, looking up at the sky where the weapon had descended from, his expression calm but no longer empty. Homelander watched him from a distance, not approaching, not speaking, because he understood that whatever line had been crossed tonight could not be stepped back over. This wasn't a fight that had ended. This was a reality that had shifted. The world had tried to treat Saitama like a problem to be solved, and in doing so, had revealed itself to him in a way that could never be unseen. Saitama lowered his gaze from the sky and looked around the ruined compound one last time, taking in the broken metal, the scorched asphalt, and the people who had retreated to the edges of the light. He didn't look angry. He looked resolved in the simplest way possible, like someone who had finally decided what to do about a persistent inconvenience. Then he bent his knees slightly and jumped. The air cracked like thunder as he vanished upward, leaving behind a shockwave that rattled every loose surface in the compound. Cameras caught only a blur before losing him entirely, and observers across the world stared at empty sky feeds, trying to track something that had already moved beyond their ability to follow. Homelander looked up and realized with a sinking feeling that Saitama wasn't leaving. He was going toward the source. High above the atmosphere, military satellites shifted positions automatically, reacting to unknown motion entering their field of view. Sensors registered a rapidly approaching object that did not match any known craft or debris, and operators scrambled to identify it before realizing there was no time to respond. Saitama moved through the upper atmosphere without effort, eyes fixed on the cluster of machines that had watched him, measured him, and ultimately fired on him. He reached the first satellite and tapped it lightly with his knuckles. The structure crumpled inward like a crushed soda can, panels folding and snapping apart as pieces drifted away into space. He didn't pause to watch the debris float. He moved to the next one and the next, methodically disabling every piece of hardware positioned to observe or target the planet below. Each tap was gentle, controlled, almost polite, but the effect was absolute. On the ground, screens in command centers across the world began going dark one by one. Feeds cut out. Signals dropped. Entire networks lost contact with assets they had relied on for decades. Confused voices filled rooms as operators realized their eyes in the sky were disappearing faster than they could report it. No explosions lit up the night. No dramatic failures occurred. The system simply stopped existing. Within minutes, the world's most advanced surveillance and weapons platforms had been erased by a man who had never even learned their names. Saitama floated for a moment in the silence of space, looking down at the planet below with a neutral expression. He wasn't thinking about geopolitics or military balance. He was thinking about the children in the trailer and the ambulance in the ditch. He turned himself slowly and began descending back toward Earth. When he landed again at the edge of the ruined compound, the people still there barely reacted. They had already seen too much to be surprised by anything else. Homelander approached cautiously, looking at Saitama with an expression that no one had ever seen on him before. Not pride, not anger, not superiority, but uncertainty. Saitama looked at him and asked, "They can't do that again now, right?" Homelander didn't answer immediately because he didn't know how to explain that Saitama had just changed the balance of power for the entire planet. Finally, he shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. Saitama nodded, satisfied with that simple confirmation. He looked around at the wreckage one last time, then turned and began walking away from the compound toward the dark road beyond. No one tried to stop him. No one asked where he was going. They understood instinctively that whatever he chose to do next was beyond their influence. Behind him, Vought's most secret program was gone. The world's most powerful surveillance network was gone. Governments were left blind, scrambling to understand how their control had evaporated in less than an hour. And in the middle of it all, the image replayed across every surviving screen was not of destruction, but of a bald man in a yellow suit walking quietly away from a place that would never operate again. The world did not return to normal. It couldn't, because now everyone knew there was someone who could end anything at any time, not out of anger, not out of conquest, but simply because he decided something was wrong. And that knowledge changed everything.